Hello, welcome back to Business 100. This is the video quiz and lecture for Chapter 3. Let's get started. Now, Chapter 3 deals with international business, so we're going to talk about some different things. Um, if you look here, these are some of the objectives of the chapter. We're not going to cover them all. Explore some of the factors within the international trade environment that influence business. Investigate some of the economic, legal, political, social, cultural, and technological barriers to doing international business. Specify some of the agreements, alliances, and organizations that may, and keep that word there, may encourage trade across international boundaries. Summarize the different levels of organizational involvement in international trade, and contrast two basic strategies used in international business. Now, the first thing we've got here is the role of international business. And if you look here, international business, we've got buying, selling, and trading. Okay, so we're buying, selling, and trading goods and services across international boundaries. Most of the world's population and 2/3 of its total purchasing power are outside the United States. This is something that a lot of American businessmen don't think about. They think, oh, America is the world's biggest market, which it is, and that's good enough. Well, there's a huge potential if you've got the right product and the right organization to market these things internationally and make a lot more money. Global marketing requires balancing global brands with the needs of local consumers. Now, what they're trying to say here is you can't just say, okay, this is what works in America, and I'll just do that all over the world, because it doesn't work that way. Different people, different cultures, they've got different signals, they have different needs. They have different cultural values. So the way, for example, you market a product to somebody here in the United States, that might not work if you're trying to market to somebody in Asia or Africa or wherever else you're looking. So those are the things we're going to be interested in and that are important when we talk about international trade. This is an example of this. This is a McDonald's in Beijing, which is in China. And it doesn't look, there's a lot of similarities to an American McDonald's. They've got the big M, they've got McDonald's written on there, they got the red and yellow. But when you look closer, look at these people right here. What are they doing? They're lined up outside the McDonald's. This McDonald's has a place where you can come in off the sidewalk and order food. I don't think I've ever seen a US McDonald's that looks like that has a line outside. But in China, people like to buy their food on the street, standing in line. So McDonald's had to adapt. I'm sure there are menu items. Maybe even the burgers don't taste the same. They might have to flavor the burger a certain way to where Chinese people are comfortable with it and want to eat it. So those are kind of some examples of the differences um, in cultures that you might be having to deal with if you're involved in international business. Now, here, why do nations trade? The reasons we trade is because trade makes both parties better off. The same reason you go down to the store, okay? Maybe you have a job. Maybe you work at Walmart, okay, and you're really good at putting things on the shelf, okay? You stock the shelves. You're good at that and can generate quite a bit of money for yourself by doing something you're good at. Maybe you're not very good at cooking burgers. So you benefit when you go down to the McDonald's and you pay them money for the burger. You benefit because you're better off with the burger than anything else you could buy with the money. And McDonald's prefers the money and the things they could buy with it to the burger. Both parties are made better off. International trade doesn't work any differently. Now, when nations trade, some of the reasons are absolute advantage. Okay, maybe one country is absolutely better than everyone else at producing a particular crop, like Hawaii with pineapples. Okay, if we tried to grow our own pineapples here in Alabama, it wouldn't work. We don't have the right climate, the right soil, the right conditions for pineapples. Okay, so Hawaii might have an absolute advantage over Alabama in the production of pineapples. This might even result in a monopoly. I can't think of any, but diamonds, South Africa has a lot of diamonds. They're not the only ones who produce diamonds, but they produce most diamonds in the world. They have the best diamond mines. So we might say they have an absolute advantage in producing diamonds. Okay, and it could result in a monopoly, but I can't think of one that has. The next thing we have, and this is the basis of most international trade, is something called comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is the basis of most international trade when a company specializes in products that it can supply more efficiently or at a lower cost than it can produce other items. So to give you an example of this, let's use cars and planes. Workers in the United States are better educated and more advanced technologically, let's say, than they are in China and in Mexico. So in the U.S., if it comes to producing cars or airplanes, the U.S. workers might be better at both. They might be better at producing cars and airplanes than workers in Mexico. However, the U.S. will specialize in the production of the good that they have the largest comparative advantage in. So let's say an American plane worker could make one American worker could make one plane, and if he didn't make a plane, he could make two cars. Okay. So for every plane an American worker makes, we give up two cars. That's the opportunity cost of the plane. Meanwhile, in Mexico, they aren't as good at plane making and they aren't as good at car working, but they have to use so much labor to make one plane that the amount of labor they'd use to make one plane, they could make 10 cars with. So the opportunity cost of a plane in Mexico would be 1/10 of a car. I'm sorry, excuse me, 10 cars, a high opportunity cost. Meanwhile, in the US, by making a plane, we only give up two cars. The opportunity cost is lower in the US for making a plane. So if US workers focused and specialized only in making planes, we'd have more planes than if the Mexicans had to make their own planes. On the other hand, if Mexican workers focused only on making cars, we would have more cars and more planes and then trade between each other, and we'd both be better off, the Mexicans and people in America, the United States. So that's the basis of most international trade, is this comparative advantage. The country will specialize in producing the goods and services that have the lowest opportunity cost for them. Now, outsourcing is the transferring of manufacturing or other tasks, such as data processing, to countries where labor and supplies are less expensive. We all know a perfect example of this here in the US, and that's customer service, 1-800 numbers. If you call your bank or if you call a company on an 800 number for customer service, you're oftentimes getting transferred to somebody in India, the Philippines, somewhere else. And that is because labor costs are lower there. In India and the Philippines, they speak English. So why not let them answer a phone call rather than have an American worker who have to pay much more? Now, at first, it doesn't sound all that great, right? So, oh, they're stealing our jobs, with cheap labor. But the problem is that it frees up American workers to do things that they're more productive at, like making cars. So people in India can answer the phone calls, while people in America specialize in producing jets and cars and these things. More phone calls get answered, more jets and cars get produced. We trade with India. Both countries are better off. So outsourcing isn't in and of itself a bad thing. Trade between two countries. The country selling goods to another country is the exporter. The country buying goods from another country is what we call the importer. Okay? So the US produces a Boeing 777 and sells it to an airline in China. The US is exporting the 777. The Chinese airline in China are the ones importing the 777. Okay. Now, in the US, this is from 2016, we exported $2.2 trillion worth of goods. In the US, the export-import market is a small portion of what we produce. In this case, roughly around 10%. In some countries, export-import markets are large portions of what their country produces. A lot of students here come from Ivory Coast. They make a lot of cocoa. They grow it. Now, they can't eat all this cocoa. They don't, they probably like cocoa, but they don't like it that much. So a large percentage of their economy, in this case producing cocoa, is producing cocoa they don't want. They want to use that cocoa to trade on international markets and get soaps and cars and manufactured goods that we produce. So we benefit because we get more hot chocolate, and they benefit by getting more cars and soaps and manufactured goods than their economy could provide if they produced them themselves. Now, as I said, this is maybe 10% of the US market. We import more from the rest of the world than we sell to it. Here, we import about $2.7 trillion. A lot of that might be raw materials like oil and iron that we use to make cars and to fuel our homes. And if you watch TV and politicians, especially Donald Trump, a lot of them say this is a bad thing. This is a horrible thing that we get more from the rest of the world than we send back to them in terms of dollars. In reality, this doesn't have to be a bad thing. Think about it. What if you only had to give up $2.27 worth of stuff and somebody gave you back $2.70 worth of stuff? I'd take that deal any day. So we get more, theoretically, from the rest of the world than we give back. Who's going to complain about that? The other thing is that the difference here, that $500 billion, it doesn't just disappear. Where does it go? Well, a lot of it goes into foreign banks, central banks. A lot of foreign countries back their currency, or at least hold US dollars in reserve. That way, if their currency starts to tank, like it has in Turkey or Venezuela, they will use these reserves, these dollars that they saved and put in their central bank, to buy back their own currency, increasing the demand for it on foreign exchange markets and propping up its value. Now, this is a very bad move oftentimes because there's an underlying reason why their currency is depreciating. And unless they can fix that before they run out of reserves, they're just going to run out of reserves. But a lot of our dollars are held in central banks. So China, for example, every dollar that enters the Chinese banking system, at midnight, the Chinese central bank comes into the commercial banks and pulls out all the dollars. And they replace them with a fixed amount of yuan. That's their currency. and then they sit on them to protect their currency in case they get another currency crisis like they did in the early 2000s or late 1990s, I believe. So a lot of these dollars just get held in central banks. That's good for us because they could be being used to buy U.S. goods and services, driving up prices, but they're just sitting in someone's central bank somewhere. Another reason why dollars don't often come back in international trade has to do with oil. All oil, oil or petroleum exporting countries, OPEC, almost all of them will only take dollars for their oil. There's only one price for oil, and it's the dollar price. So if you want to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, you can't go in there with Saudi riyals. They won't take them. They say, if you want to buy our oil, you got to pay for it in dollars. By doing so, countries and companies overseas that don't use the dollar have to accumulate dollars so that they can buy their oil. So that means they've got to export something to us, get us to pay them in dollars. Then instead of turning around using those dollars to buy a US jet plane, they turn around and use them to buy oil. The oil money oftentimes sits in what we call a petrodollar account. These are US denominated dollars, denominated bank accounts held by overseas banks from usually petroleum exporting countries. So they'll take these dollars and instead of buying stuff with them, they'll put them in their bank. Those petrodollar accounts are oftentimes used to fund liquidity. So anyway, this money sits over there in accounts and it gets used to provide liquidity in certain markets. For traders, it gets loaned back to us. A lot of these petrodollars or dollar surpluses other countries make in trade with us, they oftentimes lend it back and it gets used to build new factories and plants and businesses. So in and of itself, it isn't necessarily automatically a bad thing if we have a trade imbalance. Now here, we export less to the rest of the world than we import. So when we talk about the balance of trade, we have what's called a trade deficit. That's a negative balance of trade. We buy more from foreigners than we sell to them, so we have a trade deficit. Those countries we buy more from than they sell back to us, than we sell back to them, they would have a trade surplus. And the balance of payments is the difference between the flow of money in and out of a particular country. So here we've got exports for the U.S., and if you look, I can't remember the last time we had a positive trade balance. Okay, a lot of that is because foreigners, instead of buying stuff with us, would rather invest that money back here in the U.S. Because historically, capital, which is the money that they lend back to us to buy factories, plants, equipment, etc., has been safer in the U.S. and Western Europe than it is throughout the rest of the world. In the rest of the world, the president, the government, local strongman, mafia boss, gang leader, whatever, can come in and say, hey, that's a nice factory. Those are nice machines. This is a nice farm you've got here. It's mine now. Get out or I'll kill you. And they can get away with it. Typically, that can't happen in the West, especially U.S., other than the government. And at least up until recent times, the U.S. government has not done those types of things. The opposite of this, you could look right now is Venezuela or South Africa. In Venezuela, the Venezuelan government has come into factories and plants owned by foreigners and said, hey, where's ours? We're going to start working it. And we're not going to pay you anything for it. In South Africa, the government there has passed legislation saying that they're going to take farms away from white farmers who've been there for generations and redistribute the land. If you are a holder of foreign capital, your money to lend or money to buy assets, you can bring your money anywhere you want. Why would you put it in countries where the government's going to take your stuff? You won't. So the U.S. has typically been a safe place to put your assets. So a lot of times foreigners, instead of buying jet planes and other assets, other consumer goods or whatever back from us. I said, hey, instead of buying something, why don't I buy something in your country, or I'll lend you the money to go buy it. And then I know that it's safe. My wealth is safe. Even with China, you hear Trump complain all the time about how we buy more stuff from China than they sell back to us. I mean, than we sell back to them. But if you look here, look at what's gone on with exports. That's things that we're selling to China just over the last 16 years. It's gone from being almost insignificant around here at, say, $20 billion to now where we're dealing in $120 billion in exports to China. Free trade seldom exists, unfortunately. That is because of economic barriers, which we'll talk about, ethical, legal, and and political barriers, social and cultural barriers, and technological barriers. Economic barriers can include countries, advanced nations versus less developed nations. If you look in your book, they talk about economic development. When considering doing business abroad, U.S. people need to recognize that they cannot take for granted that other countries offer the same things as are found in industrial nations. If you wanted to go, say, to a very poor country, what they call less developed countries, what we used to call third world or underdeveloped countries, that's just a nice name for saying they're poor. If you went and tried to sell blenders, they might not have any use for them. They say, no, a blender costs me a week's worth of wages. I'll just chop stuff up with a knife, or mash it up with a pestle and a mortar. And that's more efficient for me than spending all that money on a blender. Well, here in the US, none of us would ever think of doing that because we have blenders. So that's an example of the difference between industrialized nations and less developed nations. Other economic barriers include infrastructure. Okay, infrastructure, the physical facilities that support a country's economic activities, such as railroads, highways, ports, airfields, utilities and power plants, schools, hospitals, communication systems, and commercial distribution systems. In a lot of these less developed countries, or they don't have these things, or they're in poor repair, or there aren't very many of them. I saw a very interesting show the other day on YouTube, I believe it was. I wish I could remember what it was so I could link the video. But it was about this guy, these Americans and Europeans who'd gone to Africa to make their fortunes. And this one guy, he's kind of a doer. He figures out how to get things done. And it's very difficult to ship things across Africa. The roads are poor. The drivers are poor. You can't trust people to do what they say they'll do all the time. So he gets this order for land moving equipment in South Sudan. South Sudan is a country that's had wars. They broke off from Sudan. That's now North Sudan, I guess. They broke off from them, and it's very difficult to get things done. So they want land moving equipment because they're going to clear landmines in this war-torn country. Well, the only place they could go in the whole continent and get a decent land moving equipment was South Africa, which is at the very bottom of the continent. And they're going all the way up to the top almost, just below Egypt. So this guy facilitates these things, and he actually hires American drivers, and he buys the trucks there. And even though he's dealing in South Africa, which is the most developed country in all of sub-Saharan Africa, the trucks that he buys aren't what they say they were. They need repairs. Some of them aren't capable of even running, and you have to fix them. So he has to fix these trucks and get them up there on time. He has a buyer who won't pay. He calls him up and says, hey, look, this is an expensive job. You contracted for this. You said you'd pay so much up front. They're like, no, we're not going to do it. Just get the trucks up here and we'll pay you. Then to get him up there, he has to drive on some rickety roads. He has to have very well-trained drivers. Not only do they have to be trained to drive the trucks, they also have to be mechanics. They have to be capable of doing roadside repairs, because if a truck breaks down in the middle of one of these countries, it might be hundreds of miles to the next town where they've got a technician there capable of fixing the truck. And even then, it might take a week or months to get the part in. They may not have it. So these guys have to be trained and able to fix the trucks on the road and get them running again. One of the interesting things was the differential on when these trucks went out. And they're like, oh gosh, this is something no one's going to be able to fix. They're in this little town. They're like, no, we don't have anybody fix differential. We don't have differentials for trucks like that. So the guy, one of the drivers, says, I've talked to people. I've never done it, but I've heard if you fill the differential with bananas, it'll work. So they literally have to fill this differential. They go around to all the little shops and store buying all the bananas they can get, shoving them into this differential, and it worked. And they were able to make their delivery. So those are the types of infrastructure problems that can develop. Other economic barriers include exchange rates. These can vary daily and affect the cost of imports and exports. We might have a price negotiated in, say, Thailand in the baht. When we negotiate the price, it's 8 bahts to $1, and we're going to sell this thing for 8 bahts. So we'll get $1 back. Then, by the time the deal finally takes place, maybe the baht might have devalued relative to the dollar, and it might be 16 bahts per dollar. So we sell it to them for 8. That was the agreed upon price, but instead of those 8 bahts being worth $1, they're now only worth 50 cents. That can take a big hit. That could cause us from going to being profitable to unprofitable, from having a business to not having a business. So these exchange rates between these different currencies and their fluctuation over short periods of time can cause serious problems. Governments can also intentionally value or revalue or devalue their currencies. The government could say, all right, in Brazil, it's 8 reals to the dollar. The Brazilian exports are low. The Brazilian government needs money. They need to print money up to pay their bills, whatever. Then they come out and say, oh, now it's 16 reals to the dollar. What are you going to do? Ethical, legal, and political barriers also exist to trade. When entering the international marketplace, companies must contend with potentially complex relationships. One, you have to follow your own laws. Say if you're in the U.S., you're going to follow U.S. law. Then we have to follow international law and laws within the country we're trading with. So we might need 3 different attorneys to get a deal done, and that's expensive. We're used to doing business a certain way, and they're not. You have trade restrictions. A country might say, oh, we're not trading with the U.S. Right now, the U.S. is trying to impose trade restrictions on Iran. We're trying to get the rest of the world to follow along with it. If you wanted to try and do business with someone in Iran, it's almost impossible because the government has restricted you from doing so. We've had a case with trade restrictions with Cuba for 50, 60 years. Political climates can affect trade, also ethical values. What's right and what's not right. To give you an example, in the West, if you and I agree to something and I promise you that I'll do it, that means that I'm going to do it. On the other hand, in some parts of the world, they don't have a word for this. They don't have a word for promise. In some parts of the world, it's rude to say no. So if I ask you to do something that you have no intention of doing, you'll say yes anyway, just to be nice, even though you're not going to do it. Maybe I say, all right, I'm going to ship you a container load full of coats. I need you to pick them up at the port, run them through customs, and then bring them to distributors. You might at the time say, yeah, I might be able to do that. But instead of saying, I might be able to do that, no, they'll say yes. Or I have no intention of doing it. I don't even have truck drivers that can handle this. You'll tell them yes. Hard to do business that way. You have to understand these things. Here is a story of Bobby the Bridestow Bear, the sweet cell of success. Robert Ravens and his wife bought a farm in Tasmania, excuse me. They wanted to make stuffed teddy bears with dried lavender and wheat. I have no idea how you do that. And use this to drive tourism to their farm. They got Chinese celebrities to promote the bears on social media. And they went from selling 3,500 bears to 40,000 bears. Okay. So you can, if you understand these social and cultural barriers and can deal with these barriers to trade, increase the size of your business. Okay, we've talked about this. You don't just have to obey U.S. laws. You have to obey foreign laws. There might be restrictions on how much local currency can be taken out across borders. Say you go to a country, you do a $1 million worth of business, but there are export controls on the currency, and they say, oh, you can only bring out $50,000 worth of currency a year. How are you going to get your money out of the country? There's limits on how foreign companies can operate within a country. Some fail to honor U.S. laws and or enforce laws. And in large parts of the world, copyright and patents are not held the way that they are here. So these are all things you have to deal with when you're doing business overseas. The next thing, these are political or legal barriers. You have import tariff. A fixed tariff is a specific amount of money levied on each unit of product bought into the country. So sometimes you have a fixed tariff. They say, oh, for every car you bring into the country, you have to pay a $500 tariff. There's also what we call ad valorem tariffs. This is based on the value of the item. A lot of U.S. tariffs might be ad valorem. So you go overseas and you buy some things overseas and you bring them back to the US, they'll calculate what the value of those things are and charge you a percentage of them. It's called an ad valorem tariff. You're taxing you on the value of the item, not how many you brought in. Okay. Countries may sometimes levy tariffs for political reasons. We're in that right now. Our country, the US, has imposed tariffs onto foreign countries because we believe that trade deals that were pre-negotiated or tariffs that they're placing on our goods are too high. So Trump has raised tariffs on certain Chinese goods, certain European goods, in an effort to get them to go back to the negotiating table and lower these tariffs. Okay. Exchange controls. Some control foreign trade by forcing business people to buy and sell products through their central bank. This is a big problem. When foreign currency is in short supply, the government can implement exchange controls. Okay. Quotas. That's established voluntary or by a government. We had quotas on foreign cars here many years ago. The government said only a certain number of Japanese cars can be brought in. Embargoes. These are established due to political, economic, health, or religious reasons. We've had a over 50-year embargo on trade with Cuba over political reasons because their country was communist. Dumping is something that the U.S. accuses a lot of countries of. That is selling a lot of items at below cost or cheap not to make a profit, but to run American competitors out of business. And that's called dumping. A country might also set quotas or tariffs because of that. Okay. Company may dump its product onto in another market to permit quick entry into that market when the domestic market for the firm's product is too small to support efficient level of production, or when technologically obsolete products that are no longer saleable in the country. Some countries may form cartels. OPEC is a perfect example of that, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. These are mostly Middle Eastern countries, although they include African countries and South American. Venezuela is a member of OPEC. They form a cartel to try and get good prices for their products. Now, the great thing about cartels is they don't last very long. OPEC was very powerful in the 70s. They implemented an embargo on Western countries for oil. They said, we don't want to sell oil to Western countries because they support Israel. Well, it did cause an initial jump in prices, but those higher prices caused non-OPEC countries to search harder for oil and find it. And there was a big find in the North Sea. Russia has oil. U.S. has oil. We have pumps, oil wells that under low prices are obsolete. You can't make a profit. But if OPEC were to raise their prices, these old wells could be brought back online, and then they would supply oil to the market, dropping the price and ruining the cartel. Political instability can lead to problems with international trade. Okay. Social and cultural. These are very big. I went to a conference a while back, and they talked about these. You might obviously have differences in spoken and written language. You have to, if you have translators, and make sure they're doing the right job so that both sides know what's going on. Appropriate body language, posture, facial expressions, personal space may vary. I can tell you a personal experience. I've been to Thailand. And when I went to Thailand, they told us, they said, don't touch anybody. Just don't touch them. And worst thing, don't pat anybody on the shoulder or on the head. I'm like, what would, why would I pat someone on the head? But, hey, good job, thanks, right? Don't do that. In Thailand, due to their culture and their religion, the body ranks from highest to lowest. So the lowest is your feet, the top is your head. If I were to touch you with my hands above the waist, I'm saying to you, you're beneath me. So in Thailand, you don't touch anybody. Shaking hands can be a problem in some places. Family roles may differ. Different perception of time. This is a big one. Here in the US, if you have a job, you say, all right, get here at 8 o'clock, go to lunch at 12, come back at 1, work till 5, clock out at 5 and go home. That means those times, right? If you're 8:05, you're late. In other parts of the world, it's not a big deal. Time isn't as important. There was a great story about a French tire plant that went bankrupt. And the French government wanted to get these people who'd worked in this tire plant working. They wanted to get this town back into economic shape. And they were literally willing to practically give the tire factory away. So they called a CEO of an American tire company. They said, hey, why don't you come down? We'll let you look at the tire factory. And if you want it, we'll give it to you for practically nothing, which sounded like a good idea. So he went down there. So he goes down there, visits the tire factory, comes back, and says, there's no way on God's green earth I want the thing. People are like, why? They were going to practically give it to you for a song. He said, no. They don't know how to work. He said, they go in at 8 o'clock. That doesn't mean 8 o'clock. These French workers will show up at 8:15, 8:30. He said, in America, you clock in at 8, you go to your station, you start working. He said, they don't do that. They sit around for an hour or two, drinking tea and coffee and talking about the day's news. Then they go to work maybe about 10 o'clock. Lunchtime's at 12. They clock out at 12. They go to lunch. They might come back late. He said they drink at lunch. They might come back drunk. Then, once they clock in, they don't go back to work. They sit around and talk about the day's news and drink coffee and shoot the breeze until 1 or 2, until 2. Then maybe they go back to work and they stop work 30 minutes early to get ready to go home, I guess, and then they clock out at 5 and go home. It's, I can't do business there. So these are all things you have to be acquainted with if you're going to engage in international trade. Okay, the next thing and the last thing we're going to talk about are these trade agreements. The first one is GATT. You might have heard about GATT in the news. GATT is a trade agreement originally signed by 23 nations in 1947 that provides a forum for tariff negotiations and a place where international trade problems can be discussed and resolved. Okay, so countries can file with GATT. They can go there and say, hey, XYZ countries, tariffs are too high, blah, blah, blah. From that original, 23, now there's over 100 nations will abide by GATT rules. We have the WTO, which evolved from GATT. Donald Trump has recently threatened to pull us out of the WTO. This is an international organization dealing with the rules of trade between free trade between nations. One of the big problems with the WTO is they make a distinction between developed and underdeveloped countries. And underdeveloped countries are allowed to have certain tariffs and other things that developed countries aren't allowed. China is still classified as less developed or underdeveloped. And because of this, the Chinese have certain tariffs and things that Americans don't think are fair or part of free trade. And they don't think that China's less developed anymore, being it's the second largest economy in the world. So Trump is threatening to pull us out of this. NAFTA, also being renegotiated under Trump, is a North American Free Trade Agreement. This is a agreement between the U.S. and Mexico. It protects intellectual property rights, which is a problem, especially in Mexico. If you make a movie here in the U.S., the Mexican government doesn't really care if people in Mexico make copies of the DVD and sell them. Now, of course, the movie studios don't get any money if some guy in Mexico runs off 100 copies of the one legitimate film that they sold it. So it protects intellectual property, patents, and copyrights, expands trade by requiring equal treatment, and simplifies the country of origin rules. Okay, that's NAFTA, North American Free Trade. Now, one thing is it's not free trade. Professor of mine, Murray Rothbard, said it would be very easy to have a free trade agreement. It wouldn't be very complex at all. All it would be is one piece of paper. It says, anything you want to ship and sell into our country, you can. Anything we want to ship and sell into your country, we can. And no one's going to tax or stop it at the border. NAFTA is a big, huge, long agreement. Oftentimes what it does is provide special lower tariffs or no tariffs on certain goods sold by people who are influential with the government. One example of this would be Koch Industries. They make pipes, and they lobbied for very low to no tariffs on pipes that fit a certain specification. Their pipes are the only ones manufactured that fit that specification, so they get lower tariffs than their competitors and are able to sell more pipe in Mexico. So NAFTA is not a free trade agreement, it's managed trade. It did loosen up a lot of things, but it also provides special favors and benefits to certain powerful, influential groups and countries. The European Union is one of the largest single markets today. It has a GDP of more than $19 trillion. It's almost the size of the US. And their agreement, they're trying to standardize business regulations, import duties, value-added taxes, and currency. In my view, this is the wrong way to go about doing things, and it has caused some problems. Workers in France, products in France, they don't necessarily want, other people don't necessarily want products that match those specifications, etc. There's different cultures, And really in doing this, you're almost kind of homogenizing all of Europe, which is this wonderfully diverse place full of different peoples. You go to France, they live one way. You go to Germany, they live another way. You go to Belgium, they live another way. And they're all trying to standardize everything. And a lot of people don't think it's going to work, and it's causing problems. Okay. The Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC, promotes open trade and economic and technical cooperation, holds 57% of world GDP. Associated companies have become increasingly competitive and sophisticated in global business in the last 3 decades. Original members included these countries. Since then, China is a big one you've seen added, Chile, Hong Kong, Mexico, Papua New Guinea, Russia, Chinese Taipei, which is Taiwan, and Vietnam. ASEAN promotes trade and economic integration in Southeast Asia. This is mostly an American network of countries in like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, those types of countries. World Bank loans money to underdeveloped and developing countries. We have the IMF, which promotes trade by eliminating barriers. The IMF typically will bail out failed countries. The IMF is established in 1947 to promote trade by eliminating trade barriers and fostering financial cooperation. It doesn't really do that anymore. It also fulfills some of the same functions as the World Bank. Okay, here's just a number of exporting countries in dollars. You can see that China exports a lot more than the US, which exports more than Germany and the rest of the world. One of the interesting or nice things about living in the US is this is not a huge part of our economy. It's about a tenth. In China, exports are a much larger proportion of their economy. Okay. Offshoring, we've talked about that. This is one thing I want to get into, and then we're going to end this lecture. Joint ventures and alliances. A joint venture is used in countries forbidding direct investment by foreign companies or when companies lack resources or expertise. Okay, in China, a lot of when U.S. companies want to go in to China, they can't just go in there and start buying stuff. They oftentimes will have to go in as a joint venture. Okay, and a Chinese owner has to own at least 51% of the company. Those types of people are usually the relatives of important Communist Party officials who can sort of grease the wheels so that the company can get in there and get business done and fight the red tape. This is a big problem because what if you give somebody 51% of your company? What are you getting back? Okay. So that's a big problem where companies don't allow direct foreign investment. Multinational corporations often have assets that in greater assets in countries in which they operate. Ford is a multinational corporation. Last thing we'll talk about, multinational strategy and global strategy. If you look at the book, most companies that deal in a lot of foreign trade or international business focus on what they call multinational strategy. Here, you're customizing according to cultural, technological, regional, and national differences. We saw that with the McDonald's in China. They had customized the McDonald's to make it more useful to Chinese citizens. They have that window out in the front of the store where you can walk it off the sidewalk, order something, and walk off with it. Eat it in your hand or take it home. Here in the U.S., something like that wouldn't work. We have more drive-throughs, right? So we have more people in cars. We'd rather drive through than park, get out, walk. A lot of people in China are walking or riding a bicycle home maybe, or taking public transportation and then walking from the station. To them, it's more convenient to just have a takeout window and be able to walk right up to it. Well, in the U.S., we want to drive through. So those are examples of multinational strategy. Global strategy or globalization is standardizing products for the whole world. And this doesn't work as well. If you've watched the elections, Trump talks about globalization and these global bureaucrats and politicians. They, in essence, want to make the world safe for a global strategy, and this is where we're going to sort of get at it. There is a strategy in foreign policy, and it is called neoconservatism. It's neither new nor conservative. These people were Trotskyites. They were communists. Okay, Trotsky was one of the original revolutionaries in Russia. He and two other people sort of were the next in line or competing for it under Lenin. When Lenin died, Trotsky, Stalin, and Bukharin were his sort of potential heirs, and Stalin won out. Stalin and Trotsky had a big battle about what should be done with the resources of the Soviet Union now that the communists have taken over. Should they be used to spread communism throughout the world? So should we use the things we produce, the wealth we have here in Russia, Soviet Union now, and use it to go out and make everybody else communists? Or, and that was Trotsky's view, internationalism or globalization of the communist ideology. Or should we use the resources of the Soviet Union to focus on making life better here in Russia? And that was Stalin's position, a national communist position. Stalin went out. Trotsky had to flee. Eventually, the KGB tracked Trotsky down to Mexico, and they assassinated him, death by ice pick. You can imagine how much fun that is. So anyway, all of these followers of Trotsky, when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union lost and people realized communism doesn't work, can't work, it's a failure, these guys needed something to latch onto. So they figured the US won the Cold War, we will now become neoconservatives and will spread Americanism around the globe. Managed markets, not free markets, but managed markets. So their whole purpose in life is to force or bring Americanization to the rest of the world, to make them just like us. These are the types of people that brought you the Afghan war, the Iraq war, Libya, Syria. All of these are attempts to make these countries more American. By doing so, that would open them up to companies using a global strategy. So that's the end of this lecture. Take the quiz. Have a good one. Bye.